here right now to talk again about CSS. And could you tell me, like, who of you have been yesterday to the Alexander's talk? Anyone? Yeah, there are a few people. Okay, so I have a good news for you, so for the rest of you. This will be like yet another game-based CSS talk. But this time around, you don't maybe need your laptops. You can just like follow the questions and try to guess the answers on your own. So there'll be no high scores, winners, and so on. And this is also partially because I chose this the title of this talk. If you don't recognize the reference, that's totally all right. But it's from like some fictional TV show with questions and answers. And yeah, I would like the major part of this talk to be just a bit like this fictional TV show. So I will have some questions for you about CSS and NTS and CSS variables. And I hope you will try to guess the answers and test your CSS knowledge and intuition. But before that, let me just quickly introduce myself. My name is Mikołaj, and I'm probably would describe myself as like a coding designer. I currently work at a company named ucreate, and like my main focuses are around CSS, SVG, usability, and UI. And yeah, if you'd like to follow me on those topics, probably the best place to do so is Twitter. Okay, so CSS. Yeah, I presume that before as you came here for this talk, you all love CSS, and that we all love CSS for how flexible and for how smart and awesome it is. But maybe it's also important to remember that not that long ago, it wasn't all that smart and all that powerful. And even like those few years ago, doing such a simple things as applying a border radius or a transition or a hover effect, all of that was plainly impossible with CSS. You had to use images, you had to use JavaScript, maybe Flash, and yeah, all those advancements, they came later. And when we talk about CSS custom properties, we quite often, I think, take like a similar approach. Like we see CSS custom properties as an advancement on top of the current state of, like previous state of CSS, that like polyfills something that we've done before, but not using plain CSS, but some other tools. Maybe let me illustrate it on an example. So let's say color management. I don't know, maybe you remember, but like a long time ago, there was no CSS, and we put colors like directly in a markup. Like, do you remember those good old days? Anyone here wrote this kind of stuff? Like all the HTML in caps, and yeah, that was fun. And some time later, we started to use CSS, and that was like already a good step forward because we were able to like separate the structure of the document from the styling. So a good step towards better maintainability. But as web developed, it was also not enough at some point. So another few years later, probably like the most common approach was to use preprocessors. So this time we would separate the logic from the CSS rules when it comes to stuff like colors and put our colors in variables. And this is the syntax for Sass, which is like one of the most popular preprocessors, which probably some of you are familiar with, but definitely like not the only one. And at this point, this is like no longer CSS, right? This is like a different thing. This is SCSS, so like a mix of CSS and preprocessor code, which we later compile to native CSS. And nowadays we can do more or less the same thing, but again with our native CSS features. So we can declare our variable like wherever we want. In this case, we declare it on a root level, and later use this variable basically in a similar manner, but with a bit different syntax. And there's nothing wrong about this code. I mean, it's all valid, it works. I wouldn't name it like a bad practice at any point. But it's also maybe important to remember that, like, ironically, in many cases, that's maybe like not the best usage of CSS custom properties. Like the best, like not making the full of its potential. I'm not saying like a bad one, but just not like the best possible use case you can showcase the CSS custom properties on. And that's because colors, like in most of the cases, I'm not saying all of them, but usually are the properties that at least some of them are first global, which means they covered all of the scope, and then they're static. So they basically do not change. And in such cases, using like SAS variables or any other preprocessor may actually be like a very good choice. You don't maybe need that much CSS custom properties. And you can use CSS custom properties. I mean, that's all fine. But just keep in mind that CSS custom properties are not just a replacement for preprocessor variables. There's much more than they can offer you. And probably like the main differences between, let's say SAS variables and CSS custom properties would be that CSS custom properties are dynamic. And this means that they can change their value depending on a scope, depending on a breakpoint, depending on a class, on the level of specificity where you declare them. And like this completely changes the rules of the game, because when we talk about preprocessors, like anything that happens in a preprocessor, that's like a preprocessor thing, right? This never ends up in your production code, because we don't run like SAS code on production. We run CSS. So any variables that you declared in your SAS, they basically completely gone before like anything real happens. And because of that, we cannot really manipulate them. Like we cannot manipulate variables that do not exist anymore. With CSS custom properties, that's completely different. You can manipulate them in real time in your code and any stage you want. And yeah, they are just CSS. So they are with you all the time. And I know even like in this slide deck, I can try to inspect it. And yeah, maybe let's zoom a bit. I hope that the screen is big enough for you. And here in the scope of this heading that you see, there are two variables declared, right? There's a font width and font weight variable. And basically, yeah, this is just running normal website, right? There's nothing had to be compiled here, and I still can edit those variables. I can, let's say, decide that I want my text to be a bit more condensed, or to be bold, or super thin. And what's happening right now is that I'm altering the values of those two CSS custom properties, which are declared in a scope of this particular heading. And those values override the default values of those two CSS custom properties, which are declared like on a wider scope and then used in a font variation settings property, which allows me to basically manipulate the variable font that I'm using here in this slide deck. OK, let's get back to the slides. OK, so CSS custom properties are just CSS. And there's one other funny repercussion of that that differs this solution from preprocessors. As CSS custom properties are just CSS, they also need to be valid CSS. And, well, whatever you playing with SAS or whatever, like you do not care about this being valid CSS because it's not valid CSS. Only what you compile has to be valid. And with CSS custom properties, that's different because everything you write basically should be valid CSS. And this kind of puts us in front of many new challenges in this field. And also, this is more or less what we are going to talk about today for the rest of this talk. So we're going to check out what actually can you achieve with CSS custom properties. Or maybe to put it differently, what do CSS variables know, and do they know things? Let's find out. And here is our quiz part. So yeah, a few questions for you to try to guess the answers. And the first question is, when you take a look at this code, do you think that this is valid CSS? So we have a paragraph with a class of tomato, and then there's a variable with a value of tomato, and that's used for the color property and the class of this paragraph. Valid or not? Nope, that's not valid. And yeah, as you see, our text is unfortunately not tomato at all. And this doesn't work because CSS custom properties, they have their name for a reason. They are named custom properties because you can use them only in CSS properties. Definitely not in CSS classes. And this is something that would work very well with preprocessor or JavaScript or whatever. But you cannot achieve this kind of thing just with native CSS. I mean, to fix this, the best thing I can do is to just type the name of the class manually, right? And yeah, once I write tomato, it all works and it's good to go. Lovely. Question 2. This time we have a width variable that is used for min width. And what do you think about this code? Valid or not? And unfortunately, no. This is not valid. And the thing is that as long as this min width here in the at the bottom, that's all fine. I mean, that's our normal, regular CSS property. The min width here in the top line, it's spelled exactly the same, but this is not a CSS property. This is a CSS attribute. And CSS attributes, even though it can have like the same names, they have nothing to do with CSS properties. And yeah, you cannot use CSS custom properties for CSS attributes. Again, I can use SAS for that. I can manipulate it in any other way I want that would alter my CSS, but if I want to stay native, those values have to be entered manually. And yeah, ta-da, now it works. All right, let's move to question 3. So yeah, we covered that you can use CSS custom properties only for properties. What would you say about putting them in the middle of the property? Would that work? Yes, that works all fine. And like the trick is, you can use CSS custom properties as a part of the properties value, as long as this is basically the whole of the value. So let's say padding. Padding, in fact, is not like a single CSS property. It's a shorthand property, which means this is like basically a few CSS properties written in one line. Padding top, padding bottom, padding left, and padding right. And each of those values, or some of them, can be replaced with a CSS custom property. But yeah, and this is basically going to work all fine. What I cannot do is I cannot use a CSS custom property to replace part of the value. So let's say it's not a good idea to try to keep the variable unitless and then apply a unit after the variable. Because then I'm replacing part of the value with a CSS custom property, and this is not going to work. You can only replace all of the value. All of the value in terms of like the one singular value with a certain CSS data type. But another funny thing to show here is that, yeah, this is all correct. But if I add another value to this variable, this is also correct. And a funny repercussion of that is that if you let's say take a look at this last value in the chain, you never really know where it will be used. Because depending on the spacing variable, this last value, it can be a right padding, it can be a left padding, can be a left and right, a bottom padding. There are like multiple options. If you're wondering like why so many are available, one of the hints is that an empty variable is still a valid variable. And then it also works. So yeah, just keep it in mind. Time for question 4. This time it's a bit different because we've added a calc function to the equation. And do you think that this will work? Yep, why not? So what happens in this case is that we use calc function to compute one of the padding properties values. And what happens inside the calc function is that it takes multiple CSS values as arguments. And yeah, like each of them or some of them can be easily replaced with a CSS custom property. And by the way, we just spoke a moment ago about separating the value in CSS from its unit. And calc function is actually one that will help us with that. So if we would really like to keep this spacing variable unitless, let's say make it free. Yeah, this is not working. Like you cannot have spacing just free. We still can make it work by using a calc function. So I will just delete this line for like a clear situation here. And now we have free for the spacing. And what we can do is to multiply free by, let's say, 1 rem. And this way, we are, in a, I think, quite elegant manner, separating values in CSS from their units and just applying a unit on top of them. Cool. Let's move to question 5. This time, we have a button. And then there's a gradient put on top of this button. So do you think that this will work? Yes, this works. And this works again because a gradient function is just a function that takes multiple CSS values as arguments, and each of them can be replaced by a custom property. And here we are with our beautiful magenta to tomato gradient. Question 6. Okay, that's probably my favorite one. So try to guess what will be the background of this div. Div has a class dogge, and there are some, there's a rule for this div with a background property. So maybe let's do the voting. If you think that the background of the div will be a dogge, put your hand up. Okay, okay. If you think that it will be tomato, put your hand up. All right. And third option. Oh, Mikołaj, that's a tricky question. Put your hands up. The thing is that unfortunately neither of them. It's neither dogge nor tomato. And like what happens like at the very end of the story is that our background property will compute the initial. And why is that? Yeah, I mean, can you like see this square? I think you can, yeah. It's black. Like that's another funny thing about CSS. You can manipulate initial values in CSS in some cases. Fun fact. But yeah, in this case, black is our value for initial. So yeah, like basically nothing happened. So what's going on in here? Like, first thing, why it's not a dogge? So we covered that you can use CSS custom properties in some of the functions. Let's say calc function or the gradient function. Here we have another function, a URL function. And in this case, it doesn't want to work. And yeah, like sorry, unfortunately for some quite weird legacy reasons, it doesn't work and it probably won't work. So long story short, like the simple version what is happening behind the scenes, which is maybe not exactly honest, but let's just keep it this way, is that everything you put in an URL function is just treated as URL. So this var function is not being like computed to the value of this custom property. It just stays as this. This is the URL. like period. And like unfortunately, var bracket dash dash something, that's not a valid URL, so it won't work. And yeah, like there's not much we can do about it. But here's the second question, like, if the URL doesn't work, why it's not tomato? Because let's say that we replace the var statement with some other random something. Boom, tomato, right? The fallback works. We go back to the var statement, black. So here's the beauty of CSS, that at the same time, our URL function doesn't accept CSS custom properties, and it won't work. But CSS still knows that you use a CSS custom property. And when it knows that you use a CSS custom property, and you used a CSS custom property like in a no-no way, a way that doesn't work, that bad stuff happens. Like there's no fallbacks. There's no, I don't know, like any warning message to you. There's just, OK, I don't know what to do about it. I will just compute it to initial and like, screw you. Like, there's no cascade, there's nothing. So every time you use a CSS custom property in an incorrect way, the whole property that uses this custom property will compute to initial. And this is what happens in this case. And the funny thing about CSS custom properties is that, like, basically they have like a super permissive syntax. Like, you can put almost everything you want into CSS custom properties. It doesn't have to be valid CSS. It can be your JavaScript. It can be your markup. It can be many different things. There are some exceptions, but basically you can throw whatever you want into CSS custom properties. So by definition, they're rarely invalid. But they can be invalid, like, once you try to put them into work. And once you use them in certain properties, then they basically can compute to like a value we expected, or refuse to work. And this is what we name when they don't work, then what happens is that they are invalid at computed time, which means that they are not like invalid by themselves, by definition, like the variable itself is OK. But in this certain particular context, they do not work, and then they are invalid at computed time. OK, enough talking. How to fix it? Not really. We don't really have a lot of options. Probably like the best place to start with would be to just put the whole URL function into a variable, which is kind of not ideal, but I don't really see a better way around with native CSS. If you have a better idea, let me know. I would be more than happy to know it. I haven't figured out anything else. But yeah, that's the way to fix it. And of course, if you have plenty of URLs, repeating the same function in all of your variables is probably not what you want to do. But yeah, maybe this is one of those moments when it's actually a bit better to use a preprocessor. OK. Question 7. So here we have a paragraph with a class of snow, and then there is our variable with a value of tomato, but then we declare it again. And right now it has a class of snow in the scope of this paragraph. So what happens? What will be the color of the text? Snow. Yeah, so you have to believe me that this is not white text. This is snow text. That's a huge difference in CSS. This is one of the CSS colors that actually exist. And what happens here is that basically the basic rules of cascade apply. So if you redeclare the variable further in your tree, and paragraph with a class of snow has a higher specificity than just a paragraph, this value will override let's say, the default value of tomato. And yeah, that's all cool, but can you guess what will happen if I replace Snow with, for example, Jon Snow? Yeah, it turns black. Black still would be quite a good color for a Jon Snow value, but you have to believe me that this is just an initial value for text in the slide deck. So again, we take everything down to initial. And like, why is that? Like, shouldn't it be tomato, right? Like, cascading style sheets. Like, this is what the CSS is all about. If one thing doesn't work, we look further and we like pick another thing that works. Like it doesn't make sense when you are used to other parts of CSS. But unfortunately, it makes a lot of sense when it comes to CSS custom properties. And in this case, what happens is that, yeah, Jon Snow is not a valid CSS color. And as it's not valid, it just computes to initial. Yeah, it's invalid computed time. End of the story. Yeah, and fallbacks. CSS variables have fallbacks, and you actually just can put them in the for function. So you have like the name of the variable, and then after a comma, you give a fallback. Let's say magenta. No, that's not magenta. Let's try again. Magenta. Okay, but yeah, that's not exactly the fallback we are looking for, because fallbacks for CSS custom properties work not when the CSS custom property is invalid, but when it is undeclared, which are like two kind of different concepts. In this case, CSS custom property color is perfectly declared. I mean, it works like a charm. It's just Jon Snow, right? So yeah, like there's no reason to use a fallback. And if I remove this line, it turns tomato, because right now we use the value from the line above. And the variable is still declared. If I would like to see my text being magenta, what I need to do is to remove both of those lines. And right now, yeah, what you can see is magenta. Now the fallback is used, because the color variable is not declared anyway. Go ahead.
What if you, instead of having tomato, you had tomatoes? Wouldn't it fall back to magenta?
No. Again, if I would change tomato to anything that is not a CSS color, like still the color would have a value of tomatoes, and tomatoes unfortunately do not work. And then the whole property computes to initial. Sorry, once again?
What's the meaning of the fallback then?
The fallback is used when the variable is undeclared, which means that if you have like no declaration of this variable, like in this case, we just like use this variable, but we don't declare it anywhere. Right now, we use a fallback. Okay. Yeah, and here's the thing about CSS custom properties, their permissive syntax, and the fact that they just do not want to turn invalid and to use fallbacks and so on. So yeah, we know that Jon Snow is not a valid CSS color. We covered that. But can you imagine maybe another CSS property that would accept Jon Snow as a value and would work? Any ideas? Come on. Anybody? Yeah, something more. Sorry, second? Yes, you could use it as a font family. Or you can use it as a grid area. And in this case, as well as font family or on many others, Jon Snow is a super correct CSS, because why not? And this is why this kind of variables, they cannot like turn invalid in an early stage, because in other contexts that would be like, all good working. So what we have here is we have a simple layout using CSS grid. Oh, okay. We have to wrap up quickly, and yeah, like what's happening here is that we can use our CSS property header in the grid area, but let's say we cannot replace this Jon Snow with the same property. And that's because this Jon Snow is a string. And in this case, well, that's another CSS data type. And I mean, you may be used to JavaScript when translating variables from one type to another. It's not that much of an issue. In CSS, you cannot do that. Like each of the values have their own CSS data type, and that's like static, not changeable. So if a CSS value is a string, you can only use it as a string. And you will not be able to use the same CSS custom property for both template and the area. And OK, we have 2 more examples to go. The first one will be SVG. Do you think that you can use custom properties for attributes in SVG? And the answer is yes. Just remember that not for all of them, because some of the attributes in SVG are at the same time CSS properties. And in such case, yeah, good to go. You can just use your variables directly in SVG. And just as a disclaimer, we talk here of SVG 1.1, not of SVG 2. And in SVG 1, let's say stroke and stroke width are CSS properties, but width and height are not. And if you would try to use the color property for width, then the whole of the SVG would unfortunately break. OK, and the last example. So what do you think about using CSS variables to style the use element in SVG? As long as everybody's familiar with this concept of SVG symbols. So we have a reference to a separate external file. And we try to style this external file with CSS custom properties. And yes, that's all possible. Because what happens with use element SVG is that they generate what we call a shadow DOM. And the nice part about shadow DOM is that it cannot, we cannot direct elements, target elements in shadow DOM directly. So I cannot just pick up some element from the shadow DOM and try to write a CSS for it outside of the shadow DOM. But I can totally write CSS that will be inherited by shadow DOM. And this works well for SVG symbols. This works well for web components and any other use case for shadow DOM. All right, let's quickly wrap it up. So yeah, CSS variables can only be used for CSS properties. And yeah, they work very well in shorthand properties and also in functions. For example, calc functions or gradient functions, but unfortunately not for URL functions. And syntax is super permissive. You can use almost any value as CSS variables. And on a daily basis, just keep in mind that CSS variables are valid by themselves, but they can be invalid at computed time. And properties that contain invalid CSS variables always compute to initial. They ignore any other rules of cascade. And CSS variables support fallbacks, which you declare in the var function after the name of the variable. But those fallbacks are used when the variable is undeclared, not when it is invalid. And last but not least, CSS variables are quite a nice tool to style shadow DOM, with the examples being SVG symbols and web components. Thank you a lot. That's all that I wanted to share with you today. If you have any questions or would like to cover any of those examples together, I would be more than happy to answer. And yeah, thank you.